So after I posted my video about what I wanted to see in a D&D inspired anime, I got a good amount of comments talking about how Goblin Slayer was just that. You know Goblin Slayer, that lovely show that hasn't been the least bit contentious these past few months. You've probably heard of it. Well, I had already watched the first episode at the time I was reading these comments, and everything controversial about that first episode notwithstanding, I was a little confused. I just didn't see how D&D was factoring in aside from the phrase, "he doesn't let anyone roll the dice." And I'll get to that specifically later, but suffice to say the jury was still out. So I decided to keep watching, and right now being current with the series, I can say, yeah, I still don't get it. Hold those fingers though. On the surface level, I recognize the D&D references. You'd have to be willfully ignorant not to see them. But, and I'll emphasize this, in my opinion, these hallmarks of D&D are just surface level. In watching Goblin Slayer, there's not a ton that reminds me of your typical campaign, and so to me, it ultimately fails at being a quote-unquote D&D anime. So let's discuss. Now, I don't want to throw any flack at the original author of Goblin Slayer, because he has said he's a fan of Dungeons & Dragons, so please know that the criticisms offered up are not trying to insult him or anyone else as if to say they're not a real fan of D&D, because maybe you think the references that do exist are cool and you appreciate them, and if that's the case, awesome. I'm not trying to and don't want to take that away from you. But at least to me, this story feels like its author had an idea that did originally spawn from D&D, and because of that they included some of the traditional hallmarks like dice, alignment charts, and the occasional familiar monster, but really just left it there. Let's talk about the dice, for instance. The opening part of several early episodes makes it clear that this is, on some level, taking place in a tabletop game. The gods rolled to decide the makeup of the world and eventually fell faint. I actually really like that idea. A campaign and therefore universe that has been long abandoned by its creators, and as a result the world is seemingly just falling further into chaos. Like a really messed up take on Toy Story. But I don't really think that's where the narrative of Goblin Slayer is going? Maybe it is and I've just guessed the whole plot, but that's not the point here. The whole deal with the gods rolling dice is to relate that to the tagline of the series. Which I guess means the gods are still around, and if that's the case, that kind of invalidates my whole idea. But then again, they say that the gods eventually got tired of playing dice, and that's why they created these worlds to have adventures in. Okay, this is starting to hurt to think about, but as I've had some people explain it to me, the whole idea is meant to convey the fact that Goblin Slayer doesn't take chances. Fate is in his own hands. Because in D&D, dice rolls are those chances that something could go wrong. Except that's not completely true. I understand that, especially at first glance, it seems like that, but really dice are just explanations for why stuff happens. They're skill checks. Say for example, you're in a jail cell with bars made of adamantium-coated diamond. It doesn't matter if you roll as high as possible, natural 20, 1,000 times in a row, you ain't breaking those bars. The dice may affect slight outcomes, like how much effort you exert, maybe you pull a muscle on a crit fail, but the desired outcome is not physically possible, and so in this instance for our Goblin Slayer, there is no chance to take to begin with. And I'm guessing we're not meant to take this stance of does not let anyone roll the dice literally in the context of a D&D world, because that would be broken as all hell. There's no character, playable or otherwise, who should be able to operate entirely outside the confines of a dice roll. I also don't think we're meant to see it like this because a lot of other D&D mechanics really aren't present in the overall story. Wait, are you sure you're proficient in that weapon? Okay, never mind. So are or aren't dice being rolled here? You see, it's very confusing and it seems like he's rolling a 1? That's minimum damage, come on. It's nothing to get excited over. Okay, I am like 99% sure there is no D&D spell that requires you sleeping in bed with a naked virgin. Homebrew. And really, we could bicker endlessly about what bits do or don't exist. But the thing is, at a certain point, elements of storytelling and combat transcend D&D. Going back to what I said, any interaction in any movie or show you've seen can be quantified by a dice roll. That doesn't mean, though, that everything from Assassination Classroom to Zombieland Saga has aspects of a tabletop game in them. Or maybe they do, but either way, the playing field remains level. And I do understand why, especially with this series' proposed origin, it'd make sense to think of these pieces as more prominent. But I just see them as simple homages with really not much to dig into beyond just that. Though I will still give some credit to the OP, and specifically the parts where the goblins are killed because they shatter into D6s, the most common type of dice, yes, but also the kind you roll when you're determining how much damage you've dealt with a one-handed short sword like the one Goblin Slayer wields. Those kinds of things are clever, but the opening is not the story proper, and so it can get away with these more stylistic choices. Case in point, this kind of imagery has been largely absent from the anime itself, barring maybe a handful of times. And you might very well be able to argue that Goblin Slayer makes up for this when it comes to, say, the creativity of some of the kills. Those are obviously reminiscent of D&D, right? And yeah, they are. Sometimes they're incredibly clever, and I'm not trying to insinuate that they're any less fun or complex as the ones you might think of in a tabletop game. But if you've ever played D&D or something similar, you know that this is the ideal result. It's the scenario you've envisioned, your party has meticulously planned out everything, but in practice, things rarely go this smoothly. Shit most likely hits the fan in some regard because there's an unaccounted for variable, or enemies responded in a different fashion than predicted. Or sometimes, a character just fails a check. And it's what often makes for some of the most entertaining moments in role-playing, because you have to improvise. So when I look at this group of adventurers who are working with Priestess and Goblin Slayer for the first time, have their plan go off without a hitch, I lose my suspension of disbelief. Not in the story, but in the idea that this could be any form of D&D campaign. And yes, I'm aware that Goblin Slayer does have to improvise later when they're on another mission, but if anything, I think that highlights my point, because that was really the closest it had felt to a tabletop experience thus far in the series. Before we go back to our normal shit-proof fan, that is. But to be fair to Goblin Slayer, it's not really the show's fault. That's not where the appeal of it comes from, at least I think. And it's also a story with a lot of dark fantasy elements, something which is really kind of incompatible with D&D. Not on the narrative side of things necessarily, but certainly on the player side where things are fun and goofy. Sure, there might be some serious moments, but it's still a game that can get absolutely ridiculous at times. In part because on some level we're all aware of its fictional nature and the direct impact we have on it. This is why pretty much every idea I put forth in my D&D video had the pretext of being an isekai. Because then, regardless of how assimilated your character gets, there is still a clear dividing line between what they initially perceived as normal and what their new normal is. And it's in this space where a series can really feel like it's embodying the spirit of a D&D campaign. A commonly cited example of this is Konosuba. There's a reason why I used so many clips of it in that video. They're a bunch of reject characters who are bound more by a shared stubbornness as opposed to camaraderie, they actively antagonize one another whether it's on or off the job, and yet, through all of their bumbling and fumbling, they get stuff done. It's not always the most efficient or practical, but referencing my earlier gripes with Goblin Slayer, that's entirely what D&D is about. Because I think even the most committed players are still aware that it's a game where the purpose is to have fun by embodying this new identity. And to further prove my point, I'll use a series that's been airing alongside Goblin Slayer and is the one that I think is the real D&D anime of the season. That time I got reincarnated as a slime. Now before you get busy with your retorts, I will say this series also doesn't fit the bill perfectly. Certainly not compared to the likes of Konosuba, but hey, Konosuba is massively popular, whereas I think these two, while still being tonally different, are relatively around the same level of acclaim and are still both being actively evaluated by the community at the time of recording this. As I was saying though, our sentient slime protagonist Rimuru does get way too powerful way too soon to be a realistic portrayal of a D&D character. Goblin Slayer does legitimately have the upper hand in that category. Likewise, he doesn't really have a party the same way GS does, but his befriending and eventual assimilation of just about every friendly character he meets is something that I think a lot of D&D players can relate to. And it's this, as well as several other factors that, in my opinion, more than make up for that previously mentioned shortcoming. An example of this is the fact that Rimuru definitely has his plans not go smoothly and as a result has to make the best of things. Even something as simple as getting into the Dwarven capital proves challenging as he's confronted by adventurers. Thinking it'll get the job done though, he transforms and uses his menace skill. Now, it does succeed, but at the same time, there are unforeseen consequences like getting thrown in jail because of the disturbance that was caused. It definitely falls into the category of not considering all the variables of the situation, as well as an unexpected result of trying out a new power. And even despite this setback, he still manages to find a way to accomplish his mission. All of these are things D&D players are both keenly aware of and probably have a story about. And these characteristics also extend beyond our squishy protagonist. The group of adventurers Rimuru interacts with in episode 6, for example, are a far better representation of a D&D party than the main ensemble in Goblin Slayer, despite having far less screen time. For one, their incessant bickering at each other about trivial matters feels far more genuine to me, because this is present in the other party as well, but it just feels off. Maybe it's personal preference, but it's very hard for me to tell just how well acquainted they all are. Meanwhile, in Isekai Slime, it feels like they really are just several good friends who know each other a bit too well. And the fact that they're irked by orders from their guild leader is something that could just as easily be applied to a DM by their players. There's also this entire exchange. Randomly messing with the environment and then casually threatening your fellow party member in the face of impending death? Top to bottom, this is reminiscent of some of my favorite times playing D&D. And there's actually a very similar scene in Goblin Slayer that we can contrast this with. That being when the party is running from an alligator in the sewers. There's some banter between the elf, dwarf, and lizard man, but it's not used at all to diffuse the tension, because everyone who's cracking a joke is also simultaneously trying to play the straight man, resulting in me not really knowing how to interpret it. That being said, I do think these moments generally worked quite well outside combat, because Goblin Slayer is just the ultimate socially awkward, unintentional straight man who puts everyone else to shame. But Isekai Slime always manages to maintain a lighthearted and just plain fun attitude, even when the stakes are supposedly high. Now, is any of this series intentionally trying to be referential to a tabletop campaign? I honestly can't say. But that's not the point here or with this video. If anything, I think it's meant to highlight the inverse, because it says a whole lot that a series inspired by D&D ends up evoking almost no memories of any time I've spent playing in my campaigns. Meanwhile, the one that, if it is inspired, doesn't beat me over the head with that fact, excels in this regard. It's kind of like how you're probably more likely to relate to a character who shares some of your personality traits as opposed to if they just have your name. I'm not trying to imply that subtlety is everything because, well, we are talking about anime here, but if anything, this shows that homages aren't everything. And if it only goes skin deep, then it likely isn't going to reflect the themes of what it drew from. Personally, I think it's the spirit of what you admire that should fuel your creativity. To reiterate, I'm not saying this makes Goblin Slayer bad. I'm not even suggesting that the elements being presented in this manner make it less entertaining. But when I look at these references, all I see is just blatant fan service. Fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with that, but like with normal fan service in anime, if you rip away the surface level, it loses most of its appeal. Unless you're into that, which again, is fine, but there's almost nothing present in Goblin Slayer that makes me want to sit down with some dice and make some new memories in our ongoing campaign. That time I got reincarnated as a slime, though, has me eagerly anticipating the next session and the antics that will no doubt ensue. But those are just my thoughts, and as always, I'd love to hear what you have to say. What do you think of either of these shows? Do you play a tabletop game like D&D, and has that at all influenced your opinion or enjoyment? Whatever your thoughts are, feel free to let me know down below. Thanks as always for watching, and an especially big thanks goes out to my awesome patrons, PenguinPandaZero, OverjoyedSoup, MVPino, James Morton, Marbled Ranger, Spudge, Beorn, and everyone else whose support helps make videos like these possible. Links to that Patreon if you want to join them, my shirts, and everything else are either down below or on the screen right now. Leave a like if you had fun with the video, click that bell icon to keep up to date, stay awesome, and I'll see you next time.